They said she laughed too loud, walked too fast, asked too many questions. And on that Sunday morning, as the preacher's voice thundered from the pulpit, the entire town turned its gaze toward the woman in the third pew, as if her very presence stained the walls of the church. She sat still, spine straight, hands folded over her worn Bible. Her dress was modest, her hair pinned tight, and yet none of it seemed to matter. Not after what had happened last week at the general store. Mr. Elwood had reached for her waist, pretending to brush lint off her skirt. She'd slapped him across the face with such force that he'd dropped his spectacles. People said they heard the echo all the way down by the stables, and she didn't apologize. That, they said, was the real offense. Now Reverend Hale stood before the congregation, eyes burning beneath his white brows. There is, he boomed, a spirit of defiance in our midst, a rebellious tongue, a woman who forgets her place, who speaks when she ought to listen, and who challenges decency with every step she takes. No name was spoken, but everyone knew. She kept her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar, her lips unmoving. Around her whispers slithered through the pews like snakes in dry grass. Children stared, wives tugged at their husbands' sleeves, and even the choir girls looked down at their shoes. Her father, seated beside her, said nothing, but his jaw clenched like a trap ready to spring. Her mother, eyes glossy with shame, stared into her lap, turning the corner of her handkerchief again and again between nervous fingers. She should have been used to it. The stares, the silence, the weight of judgment that pressed into her skin like sun-baked dust. But this was different. This time it was from God's house, and even if she no longer believed in what these people claimed as righteous, it still stung. When the service ended, no one spoke to her. Not even the Reverend offered a handshake. Children were pulled away before they could approach her, and Mr. Elwood stood in the doorway, nursing a bruised cheek and smirking like he'd already won. Outside, the town of Silver Hollow simmered under a sky heavy with late summer heat. The dust from wagons and boots clung to her shoes. As she walked home alone, her family having left her behind without a word, she didn't mind, not anymore. She preferred the silence. But that night, alone in her room, the silence felt different. It pressed in from the corners. It reminded her of what she'd lost, not just reputation, but something deeper, a right to belong, a place to be. She traced the edge of her Bible with one finger, its leather soft from years of use. She remembered a verse her mother once whispered when she was small and crying over a scraped knee. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake. She wasn't sure if righteousness had anything to do with it now, but she knew what persecution felt like, and she was tired. Tired of being too much for everyone and not enough for anyone. Tired of being told she needed fixing. Tired of waiting for someone to see her as whole, just as she was. Little did she know someone already had, but he didn't speak, and he never would. The door creaked open just as she reached the top step of the porch. Her father stood there, arms crossed, framed by the fading light inside. His eyes scanned her from boots to bonnet, not with worry but with something colder assessment. Dinner's cold, he muttered. Not that you deserve. She stepped past him without a word. The air inside the house was thick with boiled cabbage and judgment. Her younger brothers avoided her eyes. Her mother sat near the stove, knitting, her lips pressed into a thin line. The table was half cleared, the roast carved down to bone. A single plate remained untouched, set apart from the rest. She reached for it, but her father's voice stopped her. You brought shame into that church today. Do you think folks didn't notice? I didn't say a word, she answered quietly, her voice measured steady. That's the problem. You should have stood up and repented, shown some humility. For what? For not letting that man put his hands on me? His hands slammed down on the edge of the table. The clang of silverware echoed like a shot. You talk too much. Always have. That's why no decent man's ever stayed interested. That's why you're still here, 29 and unwed. I'd rather be alone than owned, she snapped before she could stop herself. The silence that followed was violent. Her mother's knitting stopped mid-stitch. One of the boys let out a soft breath, as if expecting an explosion. Her father stepped forward, and for a moment she thought he might strike her, but instead he leaned in, his voice low and sharp. You're not a girl anymore. You're a burden. One more outburst, one more humiliation, and I'll have no choice but to send you away. Do you understand me? She didn't answer. She only picked up the plate and walked to the kitchen sink. The food was cold, yes, but she ate it anyway, facing the window, watching the moon rise above the treetops. That night sleep refused her. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying not to cry. Not from her father's words, they had long since lost their power to wound her, but from the ache of realizing that no one in that house saw her anymore. Not truly. She thought of the other girls in town, demure, smiling, obedient, praised for their silence, admired for their stillness, the kind of women who walked 2 steps behind their husbands and never raised their voices in public. She could never be that, and maybe that was her fault. Maybe the world had no place for women who took up space. Outside her window, something moved, a shadow, tall, still, watching from beneath the cottonwood tree near the fence line. She sat up, heart pounding. He was there, the stranger, the one they called Ronan Crow, a name spoken in hushed tones with equal parts fear and contempt. He'd arrived in Silver Hollow only weeks ago, riding a black gelding and saying nothing to no one. Some claimed he was half Cheyenne, some said worse, but what mattered was this: no man dared cross him and no woman dared speak to him. And yet here he was, just beyond her window, in the dark watching, not threatening, not moving, just present. She didn't call out, she didn't move either. They sat in that distance of silence, 2 souls pushed to the edge of their world, each marked by things they couldn't change. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, swallowed by the trees. She laid back down, pulse still racing, but now, the ache in her chest had changed. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. Whispers traveled fast in Silver Hollow, especially when fear fed them. By Monday morning, every tongue in town had found a way to shape the same name, Ronan. Some said he was the son of a white officer who died drunk in a border skirmish. Others swore he came from the Black Hills, raised by wolves and spirits. But they all agreed on 2 things. He had Cheyenne blood, and he was dangerous. He didn't live in town. He never rented a room, never drank at the saloon, never tied his horse at the church hitching post. Instead, he camped just beyond the cottonwoods, where the river curved sharp and the land dipped low into shadow. Folks called it No Man's Hollow. Now it was his hollow. That morning, she saw him again. She had taken the back trail toward Miller's Creek, the one lined with blackberry brambles and rabbit tracks, trying to avoid both townsfolk and her father's temper. The basket over her arm held nothing but a book and an apple, but even that felt like a burden. A woman alone, they'd say again. The path narrowed near the old stone bridge. That's where he stood, still as one of the trees, reins loose in his hand, horse calm beneath him. His coat was worn, his boots caked with red dust and his face unreadable, but his eyes, those dark, unflinching eyes, found her. She stopped. He didn't move. A crow cawed overhead, flapping low enough to startle her horse. She steadied it by instinct, her hand brushing the animal's neck. When she looked back up, he was closer, not menacing, just present. "Morning," she said, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. He said nothing. She waited. Nothing changed. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment but defiance. Why did silence feel like judgment? Why did everyone think she needed fixing? And now, even this stranger wouldn't speak. "I know what they say about you," she muttered, mostly to herself. "Same kind of thing they say about me." His gaze didn't soften, but something shifted. Not his mouth, not his hands, just the air between them. Lighter almost, like a weight had been lifted just a little. Then he did something no one expected. He stepped aside, no words, no nod, just space, granted freely without demand. She passed him slowly, heart thudding, and dared to glance over her shoulder once. He had already turned away, mounting his horse in one smooth, silent motion. He rode off back toward the trees, back toward the hollow. That evening, at the supper table, her father grunted something about half-blood filth lurking near the eye. "Greek," her mother said grace with trembling fingers, and her brothers chuckled at some joke she didn't care to hear. She stayed silent, not about the bridge, not about the eyes, not about how, for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen no shame, just a person. Later she sat on the porch, basket by her side, the book unopened on her lap. The stars above blinked into being one by one, and the wind whispered across the plains. She listened for hooves, for breath, for the soft shift of a man watching from the trees. But he didn't come, not that night. Still she waited a little, longer, because she was starting to learn sometimes said more than 1,000 words. The wind had a taste to it that night, like copper in storm water. It howled through the gaps in the farmhouse walls, rattling shutters and teasing at curtains, the kind of wind that made animals restless and children cling to their mothers. She felt it before she heard the crackle, deep, low, like bones splintering beneath earth. Then came the scream. Not human. The horse. She was up before her feet hit the floor, breath sharp in her lungs. Outside her window a red glow painted the horizon, too bright for moonlight. Smoke slithered up like a serpent, and somewhere beyond the fields flames licked the night. The barn, she shouted as she tore out the front door. Her brothers were slower, still dressing. Her father barked orders as he stumbled down the porch, shotgun in hand. Though it was no thief that threatened them, the barn stood tall, but the fire had already taken its roof. The dry hay had ignited like kindling, turning the whole structure into a furnace. The animals inside screamed, terrified, trapped. She didn't think, didn't ask. She ran straight into the smoke. Inside was chaos, wood groaning, sparks flying. The cows thrashed against their stalls and the horses kicked wildly at their gates. She unlatched every door she could reach, coughing, eyes burning, heat blistering her skin. Something collapsed behind her. She spun too fast. A beam caught, her side knocking the breath from her lungs. The smoke closed in. She stumbled, fell, crawled, and then, arms, strong, bare, pulling her through fire like she weighed nothing. The cold night hit her skin like a slap. She gasped, dragging air into her chest. Above her, the stars blinked again, sharp and indifferent. He didn't speak. He just laid her down in the grass, checked her eyes, then stood. His hair was soaked with sweat. Ash dusted his shoulders. His gaze lingered for a second, just long enough. Then he vanished into the trees. By the time her father reached her, breathless and red-faced, the barn was nothing but bones. "You fool girl," he shouted. "You could have died in there." She tried to speak, but the smoke had taken her voice. "And who the hell pulled you out?" "One of your friends from the forest." She stayed silent. She didn't need to. He knew. And worse, he hated knowing. By morning the whole town had heard. The fire, the rescue, the silent man. They didn't thank him. They didn't ask if she was hurt. They just whispered. Why was he even near their land? What was she doing in the barn alone? You think she called him? She's not even trying to hide it anymore. Her father didn't let her leave the house that day. He paced the porch, rifle in hand, as if daring Ronan to return. Her mother prayed louder than usual, filling the silence with scripture and shame. But she sat by the window, fingers wrapped around a cup of cooled tea, and remembered the weight of those arms, the steadiness, the way he hadn't asked or scolded or hesitated. He'd seen her in the fire, and pulled her into breath again. Not because she was a lady, but because she was human. That night she lit a single candle, and placed it on the sill. A silent thank you, a sign, an offering. She didn't know if he'd see it, but somehow deep in her ribs, she knew he already had. The scar on her side healed slow, a tender line she could feel beneath her dress, every time she moved. But it wasn't the only mark that stayed. People had always watched her in Silver Hollow, judged her posture, her tone, her walk. But now, after the fire, their looks had changed. No longer amused. Now they were sharp, suspicious. She stepped into the general store 3 days later, needing flour and bandages. The bell over the door chimed as usual, but no one greeted her. Miss Elwood, red-faced and chewing the end of a cigar, didn't even glance up. She gathered her things in silence. When she reached the counter, he let her wait. Finally, without eye contact, he asked, "You bring coin or just trouble today?" She laid 2 silver pieces on the wood. "Trouble's free, always has been." He snorted, rang up her items, and said nothing else. Outside the stairs began again. A woman crossing the street, grabbed her child's hand tighter. 2 boys nudged each other, laughing into their palms. The sheriff watched from his porch, arms crossed saying nothing, just like always. But this time, there was something darker in the silence, as if they'd decided her sin was no longer just unladylike. It was something else now, tainted. She returned home. Her father was waiting by the gate, arms folded, boots planted firm in the dirt. "You went to town," he said flatly. "I needed supplies." "Supplies ain't worth your soul." She tilted her head. "What is my soul worth to you these days? Less than a sack of flour." He stepped closer, voice low and rough. "Don't you get clever with me, that savage marked you." She didn't flinch at the insult, but at how easily it rolled off his tongue. "He saved my life. You should have let one of your brothers do it, or died with some dignity." The words hung between them like a noose. She didn't answer, just walked past him, jaw clenched, blood pulsing hard in her ears. That night she dreamed of fire again, but this time she didn't burn. She walked through the flames barefoot, unafraid. while the others screamed from the edges, too scared to follow, too proud to ask why she could. And at the end of the path stood Cole, backlit by smoke and ash. He didn't move, didn't speak, but he held something in his hands, not a weapon, a flower. When she woke, the sun had barely risen. Outside her window, mist curled low across the fields like breath, and on the windowsill, just beneath where she'd placed her candle days ago, a feather, long black-tipped, and resting on the wood like it had been laid there gently. She picked it up with trembling fingers. He'd been here. No footprints, no knock at the door, just the feather. A message, perhaps, or maybe a question. Would she follow the flame, or stay where it was safe? Later that afternoon, she went to the old chapel at the edge of town. It was abandoned now, roof sagging, weeds growing between the pews, but it was quiet, untouched, and for once she could breathe without eyes on her. She sat in the front row, hands clasped, not in prayer, but in defiance of despair. She was tired of being watched, tired of being named without ever being known. And somewhere, out in the trees, there was a man who didn't ask her to change, didn't ask her anything at all. The chapel became her refuge. Each morning, just after sunrise, she walked there with a basket of bread or apples, some offering to fill the silence. And each time she found something left behind, a pine cone carved with strange patterns, a string of beads tied with rawhide, and once a smooth stone, with a perfect circle, etched into it. He never appeared, but his presence was constant, like the hush that settles before thunder. Then one morning, he was there. She had just entered the clearing when she saw him, seated on the stone wall that once lined the chapel's garden. His elbows rested on his knees, his hat low over his face, as still as the statue of a forgotten saint. She froze. He didn't move. A breeze danced between them, stirring the wild flowers at her feet. "Did you leave these?" she asked softly, lifting the string of beads from her basket. He looked up, met her eyes, and nodded. It was the first time she'd seen his face without shadow. High cheekbones, strong jaw, a scar across his brow, thin and pale, like an old story no one had dared to finish. His eyes held no malice, just knowing. She stepped forward, placing the basket beside him on the wall. Then without invitation, she sat beside it, leaving space between them, but not much. "You don't talk," she said, "but you listen." He didn't nod, didn't blink, just watched her calm and quiet. A quiet smile touched her lips. "That's rare." For a while they sat in silence. The cottonwood leaves whispered above them, and a hawk called somewhere far off. She didn't need to fill the space with words. She'd spent her life explaining herself, apologizing for her volume, her boldness, her anger. Here, none of that mattered. Finally, he reached into his coat and pulled something from the inner pocket, a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it slowly and revealed a single object, a white feather, clean and soft, bound at the base with red thread. He held it out to her. She stared at it, then at him. "What does it mean?" He tilted his head, considering her. Then finally, his lips moved. Not much, not loud, but enough. "Peace." The word struck her like lightning. She took the feather with trembling fingers, afraid to breathe. Peace, not beauty, not obedience, not silence. Peace. No man had ever offered her that before. She looked at him again, searching his face for something she couldn't name. "Why me?" she asked. He didn't answer, only stood, tipped his hat, and walked toward the trees. No goodbye, no promise. Just that same quiet presence fading into the forest. She sat there long after he disappeared, the feather clutched tight in her palm. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel ashamed for who she was. She felt chosen. Not by chance, not by pity, but by someone who saw her completely and stayed anyway. She tried to hide the feather, not because she was ashamed, quite the opposite, but because she knew what it would spark. Her father had been watching her more closely since the fire, and brothers had started whispering when they thought she wasn't listening. They knew something had changed, and they didn't like it. That morning she left the house quietly, as she always did. Just a walk, she'd said once, for fresh air. But this time she didn't even get past the fence line. Her father stepped out from the shed, shotgun slung over one shoulder, eyes cold and unreadable. "Where do you keep going?" he asked. Not like a question, but like a trap. "Nowhere," she answered. "Just out." He stepped closer, voice lowering. "You think I don't hear things, that I don't see the way you come back glowing like some girl chasing wild dreams?" She held his stare. "I'm not chasing anyone. You're being seen with him." She didn't answer. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've already ruined your name. You really want to go and ruin your soul too. My soul is mine, she said softly, and it's not broken. That's when he hit her. Not a slap. A backhanded swing meant to teach a lesson. She stumbled, caught herself, and straightened. The blood in her mouth tasted like rust. He raised the gun not to shoot, but to point. Like she was game, an animal to be driven off. You don't live under my roof no more, he said. Take your sins, and your silence, and get out. Her mother stood in the doorway, eyes brimming but mouth shut. Her brother stayed seated at the table inside, pretending not to notice. No one stopped him. No one spoke for her. She walked to her room, packed what little she had. One change of clothes, a worn Bible, and the white feather. She tucked it into the spine between Psalms and Proverbs. By noon she was walking the road alone, her boots raising dust, her body aching with every step. No one in town offered a ride. No one looked her in the eye. She headed toward the edge of Silver Hollow, where the river curved, and the land grew quiet. Her feet moved on instinct. Her heart followed something deeper, something she no longer questioned. By sundown she reached the chapel, but she didn't go inside. Instead she walked beyond it, into the cottonwoods, following the trail worn by hooves and footsteps never spoken of. She found the hollow by feel, and there, half hidden in the dusk, stood a small cabin of timber and stone. Smoke rose from the chimney. A horse grazed nearby, reins loose. She stood at the edge of the eye gag, clearing, uncertain. Then the door opened, and he was there. He didn't look surprised. He didn't ask why she'd come. He simply stepped aside. An invitation, a shelter, a wordless vow. She walked forward, past the threshold of everything she'd ever known, into a space that asked nothing of her but presence. No judgment, no shame, just peace. And still he said nothing. But in that silence she heard everything she needed. The town said she vanished. Some whispered that she'd run off in shame, maybe to the mining camps where no one knew her name. Others hinted she'd been taken, spirited away by the half-breed outlaw never to be seen again. No one mentioned the bruises on her arm. No one brought her name up in church. At the farmhouse, her mother kept her bedroom door closed and dusted, like a grave no one wanted to admit was there. Her father never spoke of her again, except once, to say she'd made her choice. But deep in the woods, beyond where maps stopped and the trails turned to deer tracks, she was learning how to breathe again. The cabin was small but solid. 2 chairs, 1 bed, a small stove. He slept outside most nights. By choice. She knew because she'd watch him from the tiny window. His form hunched near the fire, knife in hand, carving quietly into wood like it held secrets only he could read. He never tried to touch her, never entered the cabin, unless she asked. She waited, for a moment of weakness, a catch in his eyes, some flicker of hunger or demand. Never came. Instead there were gestures. The cup of water left on the table, the blanket shaken clean of leaves each morning, a snare trap reset for rabbits, so she wouldn't go hungry. One night as the wind howled hard and cold, she stepped outside to find him sitting against the tray line, arms folded, jaw tight. She walked toward him slowly, wrapped in her shawl. You don't have to sleep out here, she said. He looked up, said nothing, but when she turned to leave he followed. Inside he sat by the stove while she added kindling. They shared stew in silence. He carved while she mended a tear in her dress. The fire popped softly between them. Hours passed, and when she finally lay down exhausted from a long day of gathering wood and beating laundry against rocks, she didn't ask him to stay. He simply did. He took the floor beside her bed, one hand resting on his chest, the other on the carved feather he carried like a talisman. She kept her eyes on him through half-lidded eyes, breath slowing, limbs warm. There had been no proposal, no promise, no words, only presence, only trust. And somehow it was more binding than any vow spoken before an altar. At dawn the light filtered through the gaps in the roof, turning the cabin gold. She woke to find him already outside feeding the fire, boiling water. A new day beginning the way every life should, with small kindnesses and no fear. Later she helped him lift stones to reinforce the garden wall. They worked side by side, saying little, breathing in rhythm. And when a hawk passed overhead, calling loud and lonely, she looked up and smiled. I used to think I had to earn love, she said, not really expecting a reply. Be quieter, softer, smaller. He paused, then without turning he said just 3 words. You never did. The air caught in her throat. She didn't cry, not then, but that night, after he'd fallen asleep on the floor again, she touched the edge of the blanket covering him and whispered into the dark, "Thank you for taking me." And though he didn't stir, a quiet breath escaped his chest, steady, calm, the breath of a man who needed no words to understand what had been given and what he'd given in return. The first time she returned to town it was because winter demanded it. They needed salt, flour and oil. The snares had come up empty too many days in a row, and the creek had frozen too shallow to fish. She offered to go. He didn't argue. He simply handed her a pouch of coins, worn silver pieces, and a few flattened bullets shaped into discs, and nodded. The town hadn't changed. Same dusty streets, same crooked signs, same people standing in doorways with eyes sharp as pins. But she didn't wear mourning black, or a dress pressed into submission. She wore a plain coat, a shawl over her shoulders, and her hair braided down her back. Her boots were muddy, her hands were rough, but her spine was straight. She passed Mr. Elwood's store. He looked up, blinked once, and said nothing. Inside, the room fell silent. A woman dropped a spool of thread. Someone whispered her name like it tasted wrong. She passed through them like wind through grass. She bought what she needed, paid in full and left. On her way out she paused by the church steps, where Reverend Hale stood speaking to two older men. He turned at the sound of her boots. For a moment, no one moved. Then he cleared his throat. "You're welcome to come in. We've been concerned." She looked past him at the stained glass window where a lamb stared back, forever pure, forever silent. "No need," she said. "God's been with me just fine in the woods." And with that she walked on. Outside town he was waiting, not on a horse, on foot. He stood at the edge of the trees, arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable stillness. She caught up to him, her sack heavy with supplies. He took it without question. They said nothing on the way home, but something had shifted. That night, under a pale moon, he took a strip of rawhide and tied it gently around her wrist. No ring, no altar, no witnesses, just two hands meeting in the quiet dark. She didn't question what it meant. She didn't need to. The next morning, they shared coffee over a fire and began mending the roof together. When a stranger rode past the edge of the woods, looking for a lost cow, they didn't hide. They stood side by side in the open, as the man tipped his hat and rode on. By spring, word had spread. "She's living with him. She wears a Cheyenne charm on her wrist. They never married. They don't have to. She chose it. She wanted it. None of it mattered. Because out where the cottonwoods whispered and the wildflowers bloomed without asking permission, a new kind of life was growing, slow, stubborn, and unbothered by the noise of men. And when she woke each morning with the smell of pine in her hair, and his carved feathers above the door, she didn't think about what the town had called her. She only thought about what he never had to say, that she was home. Years passed quietly, like water over stone. She never returned to live in tune. But sometimes when the weather was kind and their supplies ran low, she walked through Silver Hollow with her chin high and her boots dusty. No longer a scandal, just a story that refused to die. The whispers faded with time, replaced by new gossip, new misfortunes. But every now and then a curious soul would stop her. "Do you miss it?" they'd ask. "Proper life, a real house, a church with pews." She'd smile and say, "I have everything I ever prayed for, just not in the way you expect." Back in the woods the cabin grew. He added a lean-to for storing herbs. She planted wildflowers near the porch. In spring, birds nested in the eaves, and in winter, smoke curled soft from the chimney like a song. They never had children, but they had peace, and that was enough. One autumn, a small boy got lost near the creek. His cries reached the trees, thin and scared. She found him by the stones, muddy and shivering. She carried him back herself. The townsfolk watched as she approached, the boy in her arms, his cheek pressed to her shoulder. They didn't speak, not at first, but someone fetched a blanket, someone else offered bread, and when the boy's mother took him, sobbing thanks, she simply nodded and turned to leave. A little girl, no more than 7, tugged at her skirts before she could go. "Are you the witch from the woods?" the girl asked. She knelt, met the child's wide eyes and smiled. "No, sweetheart," she said gently, "just a woman who stopped pretending." The girl blinked, then nodded solemnly, as if that made perfect sense. Back at the cabin, Ronan waited with carved bowls of stew and a half-finished flute in his lap. He didn't ask questions. He never did. But he looked at her hands, still damp from carrying the child, and nodded once. That night, as they sat by the fire, she watched him from across the room, his face calm, eyes closed as he listened to the wind move through the trees. She thought of who she'd been. The girl was shamed for laughing too loud. The woman slapped down for speaking up. The daughter no one claimed. And now here she was, unwed in the eyes of the church, unwashed in the minds of some. but completely, undeniably whole. They never had a wedding photo. No one carved their names into a family Bible, but they had a porch where wildflowers leaned in the breeze, a carved feather over the door, and silence that had never once felt empty. Years later, after the war came and went, and the world grew louder with trains and telegrams and new kinds of cruelty, someone wrote a letter to the county archive asking whatever happened to the woman who ran off with the Cheyenne. The reply came short. She lives in the woods, it read, with a man who never spoke her shame aloud. And that, perhaps, is the happiest ending we can ask for. Sometimes the world asks us to be smaller just to be accepted. But peace doesn't come from pleasing others. It comes from being seen and loved as we are. If this story touched something inside you, leave a comment, even just a few words to remind someone else they're not alone. And if you believe more stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We'll be waiting here, with silence that speaks louder than words.